Good afternoon. My name is Gregory Farmer, and I'm the president of the Hudson County Bar Foundation. And this is a presentation of the Hudson County Bar Foundation Oral History Committee. It's my pleasure today to interview Leonard Meyerson, a long-time, successful, and highly recognized attorney, recognized throughout the state as one of the most prominent criminal lawyers in New Jersey. Welcome, Lenny. I called you Lenny, and my first question is, have you always been known as Lenny from childhood?
Yes,
And that childhood was, as I understand it, right here in Hudson County.
yes it was.
Tell me a little bit about it. Where'd you go to high school?
I actually was born in Union City but transferred to West New York the next day.
Oh.
There was a small hospital there, and that's where I grew up in West New York. My dad was a doctor in town, and our home was in the same building that his office was in. I went to public school number 5, and then I went to Memorial High School.
After graduating high school, where'd you go to college?
I went to NYU, which was up in the Heights at that particular time, which was part of the Bronx. And then I went on to Georgetown Law Center.
Well, I'm sure some people might be looking at this, might be curious as to tuitions, because NYU is a prestigious university. When you went there, what was the tuition?
My recollection that the tuition was $300 a semester.
And thereafter, after spending all that money, you went on to Georgetown Law School.
Yes.
And when you were there, was one of your professors the well-known Edward Bennett Williams?
Yes, he was. He was a famous professor. I saw him actually in court in a matter that came out of the Second World War and became a landmark decision for appearances before committees of Congress, which did not have a true legislative purpose.
I can see that was a memorable experience.
Yes.
When you graduated from Georgetown, was there any thought of, I don't know, staying in Washington, working for the government, going some other place, perhaps to New York or Philadelphia or Chicago?
No, I really always wanted to come back to Hudson County and practice, and my uncle Abraham Miller was a practitioner in Jersey City, and he had begun practicing about 1927. Until the date of his death, he was still practicing, which was 1974.
And that firm has existed right up until now, and is one of the oldest firms in Hudson County?
Well, it's certainly up there from 1927 to the present time. I don't know of too many that actually have a longer so-called life history.
And when you came back and became associated with your uncle, a couple of things. First of all, was it like it is now? Once you passed the bar, you were able to practice law, or did you have to serve a clerkship?
No, at that time, you had to serve a clerkship. It generally ran approximately 9 months. And you would clerk for a particular lawyer, almost in an apprentice type of atmosphere. Today, the only thing that is referred to as clerkships generally are for judicial positions as judicial clerks.
And when you started with your uncle, can you describe to me the type of person he was and the kind of practice he had?
Well, Abe, as we called him, everybody called him, I called him Uncle Abe, was a exceptionally gregarious person who could never turn a case down for certainly financial reasons. He would never turn a case down. He helped people all over the place. He was active in everything except politics directly. He was active with his temple and synagogue every day. He was active with respect to every charity. He was active in certain police organizations, even though he was not a police officer. there was probably not a police officer in Jersey City who at the time didn't know him and didn't refer to him as Abe Miller.
And that was during a period of time when there was no legal services or a public defender, and he kind of filled that gap for the most part in Jersey City?
For all practical purposes, he filled that gap. You know, he also represented the people, so-called people of note, as well as the poorest people in the county.
Well, it sounds like he was somebody to emulate. When you started, what kind of practice did he have?
Well, when I came into the practice in 1959, he was, and having served part of my clerkship there and part of it with Emery, Langham, Lamb, and Blake, he had a very varied practice. He did real estate, he did civil work, he did criminal work, he did family court work. All of these things even changed somewhat while I was there at the beginning, because criminal law, he tried many murder cases, he tried every other type of case, but there was no, as you indicated, public defender at that time. In fact, when I started, there was no public defender. It came into existence probably a couple of years later, and Jack Russell was the first public defender in Hudson County. And times were different. There wasn't some of the organizations that people can go to now, they just couldn't go to.
Because they did not exist.
Because they didn't exist.
So when you came into this practice and that variety, how did you start? How did it begin?
Well, it was fortunate for me that Abe had many cases, and I believe it was former Judge Whipple who was the first prosecutor, as far as one that I knew. And he was trying to bring his calendar down at that time. And of course, the amount of lawyers versus the amount of lawyers today was much different, much lower. But as a result of that, as well as the result of people getting indicted for many offenses that they would not perhaps get indicted for today. Today, they probably, many of these cases would be tried in the municipal court, in which you appear before, simply a municipal court judge, and that's the end of the case. I'm speaking about where these cases were being heard before juries.
Now,
and that was a significant difference. So therefore, I got the opportunity to try many cases. I'm sure that by the time I was there 3 months, I had a minimum of a half a dozen jury trials under my belt, something which today doesn't happen that often unless you're with the public defender's office. Then it might happen, or the prosecutor's office.
when you started, your practice, or was your practice, a variety of legal courses, just not criminal?
Absolutely. I tried matters in the domestic relations court, which involved basically juvenile cases. I tried cases in the Superior Court cases, both civil, as we understand civil cases, and also matrimonial cases that were being heard by a Superior Court judge at that particular time. So, I mean, there were days you could go in and put 3 divorces through, and your files would be so thin that you can't imagine. Today, when anybody, my partner, Kara Corbo, who does a great deal of matrimonial, I mean, every file seems to be 1 or 2 red wells. So it was different. I tried products liability cases. I tried a matter before Judge James Rosen, who later went on to be a judge of the Circuit Court of Appeals. At that time, he was a Superior Court judge, and it involved a lawyer on the other side, George Moses Sr., who was the former judge's father, and who also, it's my understanding, was a former State Bar president. And it went on for a while, and the way I came into the case was because my client had spoken to her husband, and I had represented him in a domestic relations case involving support. And he had a very serious accident with a forklift truck, and she came to visit him in the hospital, and he told him that he wasn't going to make it, which he didn't. He did die. And that she should get the lawyer who represented him. And, you know, we did, and it turned out okay.
The firm, given that amount of volume, how many lawyers were in the firm when you joined?
When I joined, it was just Mike Cockman and my Uncle A.
Okay. And
one secretary.
And just again, and this is probably the last time I'll ask you a question about economics. When you started, what was your salary?
Well, when I started as a lawyer, I got $100 a week from my uncle.
And at that time you were married?
I was married, and in 1959, I was expecting my second child.
Now, after the experience...
My wife was.
During your experience with your uncle, did your practice go in a certain direction, like criminal law?
For a long time, I did both. Then Mike Cockman did most of the civil negligence work. Mike was an excellent lawyer and a very detailed person, and he did exceptionally good work.
As a result of your practice, I guess it took you to many courts throughout the state.
Yeah. I went to cases all over the state, basically in the northern part of the state. In the federal court, I ended up trying cases in Camden, also in Trenton, but mostly they were out of the United States District Court in Newark.
And the cases in Trenton and Camden were also in the federal court?
Yes, they were.
Now, at that time, I guess because of the political nature of the county, Hudson County was perceived to be a political boss county. Kenny and all of those people, J.B. Kenny, J.J. Kenny. How were you perceived as a lawyer when you ventured out of Hudson County?
Well, initially in some counties, you were perceived as somehow, even though you were a lawyer, as being from the area where political corruption, as some people refer to it, occurred. But once you took a stand in whatever court you were in and trying whatever case, that all disappeared. And I have to say, those were very limited counties that probably today are filled with a number of Hudson County transplants, as I would call them, living in the very vicinity where they were not welcome as lawyers, unfortunately. But on the other hand, in terms of Hudson County, because I became very active in, the trial attorneys of New Jersey. And the Trial Attorneys of New Jersey was an organization that was formed for the purpose of having all kinds of trial lawyers, not plaintiffs' lawyers, let's say like Atla, not defense lawyers like an insurance company group. It was lawyers from the plaintiffs, from the defense standpoint, lawyers who did criminal work, lawyers who were prosecutors, lawyers who did matrimonial work. It was a varied group. And as a result of that, I met lawyers throughout the state. And whatever the reasons were, over the course of time, I received many referrals from these various lawyers over the course of the years because of meeting them, talking to them, and whatever your reputation was, that either went along or it preceded you, and they felt that, I hope, that you would be, number one, candid, and you would be professional, and you would get as good a result as you could get.
And were you president of that organization?
Yes, I was president of the Trial Attorneys of New Jersey between 1983 and 1984.
Talking about the people you met in that organization statewide and things like that, looking back at it, are there people or judges who kind of stand out in your mind as memorable people?
Well, there are a number of judges, you know, today perhaps people who have to get vetted through the process go through more than perhaps judges in the past went through. But there were judges in the past who, you know, stood out in matters and connections that I had. I could say that Judge Hamill, Eddie Hamill, was a prime example. Even though he was related, in a sense, to people who were politically involved, he was, throughout anybody's conversation that I've ever had and my own personal observation, totally apolitical when it came to being totally fair. He was a superb judge. Another one was Al Fink, whose son still practices in Jersey City when he's up here. And another was Paul Duffy, you know, particularly with Paul Duffy before lunch.
Yeah. What about lawyers? Ray Brown was a practicing attorney here during your
Ray was a great great lawyer, and that was an example of where Ed Hamill was the person that he was, because Ray was representing representatives of the Black Panther, and the case was tried before Judge Hamill, and he just said you couldn't have gotten a better trial at that time, because you have to understand that was a different time period.
When you mentioned at that time, would I be correct if I said that the criminal bench, I should say bar, was pretty limited?
Yeah. There were probably, when I started, there were 3 lawyers who, you know, really did a lot of criminal work. And that was my uncle Abe Miller, that was Ray Brown, and that was Murray Cribbett. Those 3 people occupied the prime body of criminal work that was taking place.
All 3 of them had offices at General Square.
Ray, I think, was on Bergen Avenue, but the other 2 were at 40 General Square on the 2nd and 3rd floor.
Along that line, you indicated that there was the body of criminal practitioners back then amounted to 3, maybe 4 people. Over the past 50 years, how has the practice changed with respect to the kind of cases that come in? For example, is there more violence now than there was back then?
Well, I would say that if there's more violence today, it can only be attributed to one factor, and that would be drugs. There were murder cases that you tried, that involved violence. It just was a different time period in which people could say, even though it probably didn't happen all the time, that they could go to sleep with their doors unlocked. I don't know how true that was, and I kind of doubt it, except if you were in a particular area where you test that. But the violence in numbers increased as the crimes increased. A lot of things were not crimes, let's say, early on, that became crimes. And we went through an entire codification of the criminal code, because before 1979, there was no criminal code of justice. There was common law and there was statutory law, but there was no codification until about 1979. In fact, my partner, Jerry Miller, wrote the first treatise on criminal law for West Publishing, and that in itself expanded. It was a 1 volume, and then it went to 2 volumes every decade thereafter. And I myself went throughout the state speaking on the changes that were going to be taking place with the Code of Criminal Justice. Some of them I did with the guy down in Burlington County, Frank Hartman, who practiced a lot of criminal law down there. And some of them I did with Seymour Margulies, who recently passed away. And that opened up new avenues, but it also made things crimes, or crimes by other names than had existed before. You could have atrocious assault and battery, and then it wasn't that, it was aggravated assault and battery. You could have aggravated sexual assault versus rape. And these differences became more significant because as more and more crimes were added, even from that standpoint, the penalties increased and the penalties got more fixed. When I was beginning practicing, there was no mandatory sentencing, with the exception of one rule that existed in practice, but not as a rule. That meant that all gambling cases would end up, no matter where they were tried, they would be sentenced by one judge, usually the assignment judge during a particular assignment judge's period of reign, so to speak, and unless he designated someone else. And that's the way it was. Today, gambling cases, for the most part, don't exist in the courts unless it's some very organized kind of gambling operation that's outside the law. But numbers cases, you would be trying those cases. And they became interesting because of the factual pattern that existed that would even make some movies.
Talking about movies, you've had, as you indicated, a number of trials, had a lot of jury trials right at the start of your career. Looking back at it, how many cases would you have tried, do you think, in your lifetime that were jury trials?
I would say certainly 400, maybe more, maybe never counted.
Okay.
I have to remember the first 3 months I tried 6 jury trials.
Any stick out? Is my understanding that one was even made into a movie?
Well,
starring Demi Moore?
It was made into a movie, but they converted it all.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
The name of the case was State versus Stephen Azzolini and Dennis Razzo. And it arose out of a homicide in New York and a homicide in Hoboken. And it was a rather sad case. Paul DePascal, who's now a Superior Court judge, was then the chief investigator on the case. He wasn't the prosecutor. but he was the investigator, and he actually ended up being on the stand, and we had some cross-examination. Well, Paul, after the case was over, my client, one client pled guilty, and my client went the distance, was found guilty, and sentenced to prison, for which he may still be there. And because there was another homicide in New York. And what happened is Paul D. Pascal went and prepared a treatment. Treatment being something that's sort of an outline, let's say, for a movie. And you've gotten the whole outline ready, and then you submit it. And he began, it's my understanding, a lawsuit against the director, the producer, for basically taking his treatment. And the connecting link was that there had been a person in the prosecutor's office who was in charge, or close to being in charge, of the homicide section. He left the prosecutor's office and went to Hollywood, and he then became the police advisor for a movie with Al Pacino, which was called Sea of Love. And then he became an advisor to this.